Good morning. My first question is, as usual, can everyone hear me okay if I speak at this level? I have the microphone on. My second question is, how's everyone doing today? It's so nice to see so many friendly and familiar faces. This is the third time that I've been lucky enough to do a Martin lecture series in the Humanities, and I'm delighted that Ann Kinseth invited me to do this series. You may recall from the previous ones that they were hitched to specific exhibitions. The first one, the drawings of Giuseppe de Ribera, and the second one, Jacob and His 12 Sons by Zurbrod. And this time, Anne and I decided that it would be interesting to look at our own collection in depth, as she mentioned. Now, as you'll see in a moment, there's not much rhyme or reason to my selection. It's really what Adam likes. So I hope you forgive me for that. But I thought it would be interesting to sort of look at the Meadows Museum's spectacular holdings of Spanish art and choose 5 objects that spoke to different interests of mine, but also hopefully things that I can interest you in. Before I begin, though, I want to, of course, acknowledge the namesake of these lectures, the much-missed Professor Luis Martin, a longtime professor at SMU, and I'm so honored that I have been asked to specifically speak in this lecture series because Professor Martin's work was important and continues to be important for my own research. For instance, this book that he published on the Viceroyalty of Peru, and so I'm very honored that I'm here speaking to you today as the Luis Martin Lecturer in the Humanities, and I'm so delighted that Mrs. Martin is today in the audience, so thank you very much for coming. So today's lecture will be about an object that some of you may remember from the galleries. It was, when I arrived at SMU in 2016, it was actually on display upstairs. It's a large silver processional cross. And happily, it, if I understand correctly, will be back on display in the exhibition that is opening very soon in March of Alonso Berruguete, sculptor of Renaissance Spain, which will open soon. So unfortunately, we won't be able to see it in the galleries today, but please think back on this lecture when you do see it in just a few weeks' time upstairs. On the 14th, I'll speak about a portrait, Ribera's A Knight of the Order of Santiago, one of my favorite paintings in the collection, amidst a painting from the first third of the 17th century. Then I'll speak about a drawing that actually many of you might not know, and I've only ever seen it in storage, but a spectacular large drawing attributed to Matias de Torres, from a similar period, actually, as Ribera's painting. Following that, I will look at Luisa Roldan's sculpture of the infant St. John the Baptist, which I'll discuss in conjunction with another sculpture in the collection, also depicting St. John here as an adult, by Juan Martinez Montañez. And finally, I'll conclude the series on March 6th with my last lecture. You'll notice quite a jump in time into the mid-19th century. Joaquin Dominguez Becker's Ladies and Gentlemen Visiting a Patio of the Alcázar of Seville. And although it's a later painting, it'll be an interesting way to sort of think about how in that moment Spain was thinking about its past, looking back at earlier moments and earlier centuries. So this will be the 5 lectures, the topics of the 5 lectures. And you'll also notice that only 2 of them are paintings. This is something that I want to do on purpose to expand the range of objects we think about, from silverwork through drawings, through sculptures, and of course to paintings, but also 1 portrait and 1 sort of historical image or genre scene, you could say. So this is what we have to look forward to over the next few weeks together. Now, the topic today is, of course, our silver crucifix. You probably didn't notice this, but I'm actually wearing silver shoes. And you know, I said to myself this morning, I was choosing shoes, and I saw a glimmer of silver from the corner of my closet. And that's something that we should keep in mind as a quality of silver, is its, of course, noticeability. And I said, well, it's definitely a gimmick, but when else are you going to wear these very uncomfortable shoes that don't really go with anything? And so I said, this is perfect. I'm going to wear them today. So I hope you forgive me the gimmick. I did get quite a few compliments, I should admit, when I was standing at the door, so I think it worked. And so I'll first talk about silver. The object we're looking at is a silver processional crucifix. And so first we'll look at silver, then we'll look at processions, and third we'll look at crucifixes or crosses. We'll think about all of these things. As some of you know, if you've attended my Martin lectures in the past, although I often promise to focus on one thing very in depth, I actually like to expand out from it quite a bit and use it as a pretext to look at the art, the culture, and the society of the period more broadly. And that's exactly what we'll be doing today. Now, to start with silver, we should first look at this object in some detail and try to understand this object quite simply in terms of its formal qualities, its form. So, of course, this is a processional cross, an object that was meant to be lifted, carried, handled, moved. It is a quite large, I should have put the dimensions here, quite large, quite heavy object made out of a metal that is attached to a wooden core. If we look at this element, for instance, the stem is the portion which would be placed on top of a standard of some sort, or a wooden carrying pole that would allow the person carrying this object in the procession to support it without also touching and therefore tarnishing the silver. And the knot is this element here, which in our object is wonderfully sort of imitating an architectural element or some sort of small temple. You can see these small niches. You can see these columns, or more accurately, herms, because they have figures embedded within the columns. You can see the different cornices and pediments that form part of this feature here, which then is sort of the base on which the cross proper is supported. The cross proper, the terms used to describe it, cabeza, brazos, are of course terms that also describe the human body. And of course this is because the cross was the support for the human body in the crucifixion. The arms of Christ were attached to the arms of the cross. His head rested on the head of the cross behind him. And you can see here that what I find interesting about these objects is their ornamentation becomes so rich, so full, that it almost sort of obscures what the shape of the actual object is. In some ways, it's sort of moving past the simple shape of two pieces of wood to become a much more visually complex object. And on top of this, there are figural roundels, that is to say small round panels with figures on both sides of the cross, one at each end of it and a much larger one in the center. The materials for the cross, as I mentioned, are both silver, but also gilded silver, so silver that's been covered in gold. And you can, in certain places, just make out the gold that's been applied here. You can make out a slight difference of color. And it's also been made using a variety of artistic techniques. These include casting, cast elements, so elements that are where molten silver is poured into a mold, and then after cooled, it's taken out of the mold, or the mold is broken from around it and is attached as a single piece to the larger whole. That's probably also the case with these figures of saints, certainly the case with these small heads of putti. There is a technique called repousser, literally pushing. It's also sometimes known as chasing or tooling. These are the terms that are used to describe it. And this is a technique that uses thin sheets of silver or another metal that are placed on top of some sort of matrix and hammered in order to create a three-dimensional decoration. And those are then either wrapped or attached in other ways to the larger cross. And we also see engraving. So engraving, a technique that is, of course, a technique also used in printing in the period, where the artist uses a tool such as a burin in order to quite simply scratch out or carve out pieces of the metal, actually removing pieces of the metal in order to create a design. And so if we look here, you can see that here it's a flat design in which these small ridges have been carved out with a tool in order to create this wonderful design that's known as strap work. Now, the sources of the artists are likely to have been printed sort of artists' manuals or artists' books, such as this one by Hans Vredeman de Vries. These were quite literally books of ornament. One could order such a book and then flip through page after page after page of these sorts of ornamental designs, different sorts of cartouches, frames that included all sorts of these ornamental motifs, strap works, roll works. All of these were terms that would have been familiar, and you can see, I think, some similarities in both this design on our cross from Vredeman de Vries's book, or in this panel from the very beginning of one of the arms of the cross. I think you can see precisely these rolling elements, these sort of cutouts that also appear in Vredeman de Vries's ornament handbook, if you will. So these are, even though the book is printed in Rome and one of many editions of the book, these kinds of objects circulated very widely. Painters like Francisco de Zurbarán, who I mentioned, used prints in their practice, and of course other types of artists also turned to prints when they were looking for inspiration for the hippest artistic techniques of the day. Of course, this is a three-dimensional object, but it's an object that really has, in some ways, a front and a back more than a well-developed side. In some ways, you could say they're both the front, because neither one is privileged over the other. On one side, we have this beautiful gilded roundel of the Virgin Mary holding the infant Christ. And on the other side, we have the scene of the crucifixion, with the crucified Christ here not attached to any smaller cross, but actually here now suspended from this cross becoming the object of his passion, and then a scene that's also engraved of the three crosses on Golgotha, on the Hill of Skulls, here behind him. So this is the type of object that would have that we have upstairs and that would have been processed through the streets. So we've now sort of walked through it together, and we can begin to talk about some of the other elements that will interest us. The first of these is, of course, the silver itself. Now, this is an object from the second half of the 16th century. We don't have a precise date for it. It's thought to be made between the 1560s and the late 1590s. Those are the dates in which the artists to which the object is attributed were active, but we don't have a narrower time frame. However, at that point, it's likely that some, if not all, of the silver from which it is made likely came from the Americas. And it likely came from this place. This is the city of Potosí in present-day Bolivia, where in 1545 the largest silver vein in the history of mankind's exploitation of silver was discovered. It became the real boon, economic boon for the Spanish Empire, which began to very aggressively exploit these massive silver deposits. This was not a hospitable place. This is very, very high in the Andean highlands, surrounded by mountains. It's freezing. The air is very thin, but of course the economic potential of this place meant that an enormous and very wealthy city very quickly arose around it. And you can see here, this is an 18th century painting of Potosi. You can see here that it's a large gridded city that sort of all goes towards this, this element, this large hill. And this is the so-called Cerro Rico, the rich hill. And it's indeed, this is where the silver deposits are. Even in Spanish today, you can say that esto no vale un Potosí. It's not worth a Potosí. It still means that this isn't worth anything. So the idea of Potosí is still embedded, even in contemporary Spanish, as an exclamation of wealth or of well-being, but especially of economic wealth. You can see here, this is sorry for the graininess of this image, but it's a large hill with a sort of smaller protuberance in the front. This is how it actually still looks like today. So this is, and you can see some of the sort of terraces that speak to this, this hill's exploitation during centuries. Interestingly, this is a site that's very frequently depicted in colonial Bolivian painting from the 17th century onward, oftentimes inserting the figure of the Virgin Mary directly into the mountain. And scholars have spent a lot of times debating why this might be. On the one hand, of course, it seems to be an expression of the fact that the wealth that was found in this mountain is a sign of divine providence, of some sort of divine support for the Spanish colonial project. Therefore, the Virgin and the various saints in the Trinity are supporting the sort of Spanish hierarchy that's here at the bottom, whereas on the hill itself you can see figures identifiable as indigenous Andeans. This is an Inca figure. There are llamas, so there's elements that are meant to be recognizable as part of the Andean landscape. But also scholars have interpreted this as a syncretic image that's combining pre-Columbian beliefs about earth deities, specifically Pachamama, who was believed to be a female deity associated with the mountain and with earth, who's becoming here sort of conflated with the image of the Virgin Mary. But of course, this is all around this silver mountain from which perhaps the very silver of our own cross may come. Now, of course, the exploitation of this silver was brutal, back-breaking labor. The Spanish, when they conquered Peru, immediately replicated the system of Inca labor that had been established there for a number of centuries, requiring people from indigenous communities to sort of grant their labor to the Spanish overlords. And you can see here an image of the mine of Potosi with these individuals sort of laboring in the dark by candlelight. Even more terrible were the mines of Huancavelica near Potosi, which were mercury mines. Mercury was, of course, necessary for the later processing of the raw silver ore, and it's estimated that of the people who worked in Huancavelica, probably 90 to 95% of them died within a year. So this was an absolutely brutal industry, but one that, of course, was sort of hungry, right? Spanish silver was what, in some ways, allowed the sort of flourishing of Spanish culture that we see here. So in some ways, it's important to think of both sides of the coin, as it were. Now, once the silver was brought out of the hill, once it was processed, it was taken to the mint of Potosi, but also to mints in other colonial cities, where these types of objects would be produced for transport. So these sort of silver ingots or silver coins would be minted there. These objects would either circulate locally within South America, or they would be shipped to Europe. I recently read an amazing statistic that it's estimated that 80% of all of the silver mined in Potosi was in China by the year 1800. And this is an extraordinary thing that to me really speaks to the sort of globalization of the world before this sort of era that we consider to be a globalized era, right? So this is telling us that China in the period did not have major silver deposits. However, they were very desirous of having silver. And so we see that this is a back and forth of American silver probably coming via Europe or going directly through Mexico to Asia, being exchanged for various Asian goods, especially porcelain, but also silk, and so on and so forth. So it's an amazing thought that how these kinds of items, objects, and currency are circulating in the pre-modern world. Now, today it's easy to travel. Sometimes we still complain about layovers. But it took many, many months to get from the ports of Mexico to Europe. Sure enough, not every ship made it. I'm showing you here two 17th century drawings of suggested ways to salvage silver from shipwrecks. I don't know that these were ever actually practiced. I don't know how successful a mechanism for breathing underwater this would have been without an actual air pump. However, you can see that it was a real concern. It's not surprising. Again, I'll mention poor Francisco de Zurbarán, the 17th century painter. One of the thoughts about why he died in poverty is because he had speculated. He had played on the American market. He had sent off all of his paintings, all of his artistic output to be sold in the Americas. And it so happened that 2 years in a row, storms sank the American fleet with all of the money that he was expecting to get from it. So this was a real concern, and therefore it's not surprising that people were thinking about how to get this money back. And of course, you may, if you've ever been to Key West, you may know of this figure, Mel Fisher, quite a controversial figure around the 1980s when he discovered a shipwreck of the Nuestra Señora de Atocha, a massively wealthy, sort of massive amount of silver, gold, as well as you can see here, actual sort of worked art objects that he found off of the coast of Florida. It was quite a contentious issue with Spain, Peru, Colombia, and of course Mel Fisher himself, all arguing that actually it didn't matter that 400 years had passed, but that this was still Spanish gold. The Peru saying, well, actually, no, it was taken under duress. It's Peruvian silver. And finally, Mel Fisher, if I recall correctly, being granted quite a bit of it, given that he claimed that he had invested in it and found it, of course, in international waters. So if you go to Key West, you can visit the Mel Fisher Museum, where there are some actually incredible 16th and 17th century artifacts on display that sort of document this period we're talking about. So silver, clearly a hot topic, clearly a difficult but also rich topic to think about. And so I'll conclude this section by telling you about one particularly interesting figure, Juan de Arfe y Villaamil. He was a silver and goldsmith of German descent who lived in Spain in the 16th century. He was not only the creator of such spectacular monumental objects such as the massive monstrance of the Cathedral of Seville, that is to say this enormous, this measures 10 feet, if not more. It's 3 meters 80, so yes, it's more than 10 feet. At the very center of which the Eucharist or the host would be carried around in processions. It still is, actually. It's sort of amazing to think that this massive 16th century object is still processed every year during processions of Corpus Christi in June. But he was also a theoretician, a writer, a scholar. Right? He produced multiple publications, 3 of which are most notable, that discussed the importance and meaning of silver, also how to work and prepare silver, and more generally how to create aesthetically pleasing, proportionate objects from this material. Here's one example. This is an engraving of this very object that he created, and another one of this smaller monstrance. And the first book that I'll show you is his Quilatador de la Plata, Oro y Piedras, his assayer of silver, gold, and gemstones. This is the book that he published. And it gives us a sense, again, of how contentious these sort of issues around silver was, how valuable silver was in the period. It includes various images of the tools of the assayer, that is to say, how to correctly weigh and test various precious metals and stones, including this wonderful scale here, as well as a furnace here, so the correct ways to then melt or work these kinds of materials. And he writes his justification for this project. He says, while I was in Seville making the monstrance for the cathedral of that city, he can't let us forget that he got that very fancy commission, there occurred in these kingdoms some complaints and disagreements about coinage of silver and gold, and that there lacked a common law and system of weights. Because this was such an important matter, His Majesty, Philip II, ordered that all assayers from the mints come to court. He had them convey their knowledge to the ministers that His Majesty called for the purpose, and this revealed that there was so much misinformation among the assayers, and so little science and certainty in what some of them did, that it was necessary for His Majesty to order a new law concerning the testing and weight of coinage and its defects. So we're seeing that it's precisely in this period that our very crucifix is being made, is that the very value of silver is being discussed, debated, and is trying to be standardized. So we're seeing also silver as an idea in this period is becoming, in some ways, regularized and subjected to new laws and regulations. In his second important book, De Varia Commensuración, about the measurement of sculpture, architecture, and so on, this really in some ways is both a theoretical text and a manual for artists. And he includes all sorts of wonderful illustrations from these geometric measurements, which are of course going to be important for both architects and artists, to the proportions of the human body. You can see here his sort of cross sections of heads with measurements of torsos, of legs and feet. If you've ever learned how to draw from a book, these kinds of images won't be foreign to you. So there's also a sense that you can actually learn from studying this book, to sort of more fully fleshed out studies of anatomy. Now, what interests us is his instructions for how to create objects that are going to be used in the liturgy, that are going to be used in churches, and specifically in processions. And here's examples of his suggestions for designs for, once more, monstrances. Now, in Book 4, Chapter 3, he writes about processional pieces. And he specifically writes about crosses. He writes, these crosses, processional crosses, are made in different ways. Some are made from metal sheets that are chased and then hammered onto wood. We've talked about this technique, also known as repoussé. And these are very fragile, he complains. They make others with the arms made as a whole, either soldered separately or nailed with supporting elements. And this is used when the surfaces of the cross are not entirely flat, as ours are. Because when they take them out in processions, some people who carry them simply prop them up against walls without any respect, and they are easily damaged if their endings are too thin. I thought this was such a wonderful little sort of insight into otherwise a very dry text that gives us a sense of the sort of lived qualities of these objects, how these objects were actually used, and what kinds of considerations artists had to think about when making them, right? If you make this too thin, well, then someone who is very, very tired on a hot civilian day is going to probably, well, they might fall asleep and the cross is going to sort of tip from their hands. And if it's not solidly made, then the sort of thin strips of metal attached to wood might, for instance, disattach. This wonderful painting by Mariano Fortuny, a procession caught by the rain, and I think it gives us a little bit of a sense of the somewhat precipitous nature of these processions and the risks that they could pose to these objects, which are, after all, being brought out into the elements, out of the comfort of their regular homes. And you can see here the procession is sort of fleeing the rain, and the cross is tipped to a sort of, I would say, worrisome angle as they're trying desperately to rush back into the church and prevent it and themselves from getting wet. So this, I think, gives us a wonderful idea. And also, what a beautiful painting. Now, what I found particularly interesting is the illustration that he includes to give artists an idea of proportions for how to correctly create a processional crucifix. This is the sheet of paper that is directly after the chapter that I just quoted for you. And I thought it was quite interesting of how closely our own cross sort of mimics or fits with the proportions that Arfe Villafañe suggests or dictates for the processional cross. It almost makes me wonder whether, for instance, our artists may have had access to this book, or whether this is sort of common knowledge that would have been shared and familiar to anyone working within the silver guild system, right? So this is a sort of question, but in any case, I think it's clear that this is a shared sort of universe of thinking about proportions, and it also makes us think about the sort of mathematical precision with which the artists of our cross approached the designing and execution of such a complex object. Now, we've talked about silver, and I'll now move on to talking about processions, the very sort of events for which these kinds of objects were being made in the period. Processions were a crucial element of daily life in medieval and early modern Europe. Early modern, I should note, is of course the term that is now more commonly used than, say, Renaissance and Baroque. It's a period that encompasses, you could say, anything from around 1400 to 1700 or so. So when I say early modern, I don't mean Picasso necessarily, but I mean this earlier period. So medieval and early modern period Europe would have been filled with processions. This would have been a way in which many people experienced the spaces of their cities. These were crucial rituals performed in very standardized ways on specific occasions. Religious processions were, of course, a fundamental element of these and probably the most common kind of procession, although we can, of course, also think of, for instance, a new ruler being crowned, a new viceroy or governor arriving in a city. These would have also required processions. Of course, these kinds of events are about movement. They're about movement through space, right? And we can always see in these wonderful images that depict processions, there's always a very clear directionality in them, thinking about how these figures move through space in here, St. Mark's Square in Venice, and then wrap around here. And we can see, of course, that they're also carrying objects. This is now no surprise to us. They're carrying these kinds of processional objects that we've been discussing. What I find so interesting is it's a little bit hard to tell what they're carrying here, but it's actually a cross. You can this is a specific cross that's associated with a specific relic in Venice, and you can see here these are the arms and the head, and then the knot and the stem of it. So the elements that are now familiar. What I find so interesting is that The artist here sacrificed in some ways the legibility of this object. He didn't depict it as a cross that would be legible to us in order to make sure that it's clear that we know that it's moving through space. So we're seeing it as if it were a sort of cross-section of it, rather than seeing it as a legible object. What's important about processions is that in some ways they have an almost quasi-magical character. When you process these kinds of objects through space, and these could be crosses, they could be sculptures or paintings that were believed to have particularly powerful religious meaning. These could be relics of saints, that is to say, body parts of or objects associated with saints that were believed to have, for instance, curative or protective properties. When you moved these kinds of objects, when you took them outside of their regular spaces in which they were kept, they somehow extended this power over the entire city, right? So in a way, this was a manner of activating these objects and of ritually and repeatedly and regularly allowing them to spread this beneficial power that they had over the space that normally hosted them. We see these kinds of events, again, as I said, throughout the period. These are two fantastic paintings in the Prado of the so-called Omegang, processions of Our Lady of Sablon in Brussels. Brussels was at the time a city under Spanish governorship. And you can see here once more this wonderful directionality here as it weaves through this very, very long painting with hundreds and hundreds of figures. And we can, of course, see the elements that I've been mentioning. So in this case, we're seeing two groups of friars or perhaps some sort of confraternity officials carrying religious sculptures. Here a three-dimensional sculpture of the Virgin with Child, and here just a bust-length figure. They're also carrying large crosses on these kinds of poles with banners. So our cross may have been carried either higher up or much more close to the body. And we can just see here that there are, of course, musicians. Now, that's also something important to, and I should point out they're right here, they're playing these sorts of long, some sort of wind instruments. That's an important element to consider. That these are, of course, multi-sensory events. Because they occur outside, they activate more than just the sense of sight. They activate the sense of hearing, they activate the sense of smell. We saw that weather can, of course, affect them. So in some ways, they affect every human capacity for sense, for perception. In some ways, much more than you could say a painting that's hanging on the wall, right? We see them throughout the colonial world as well. Once Spain conquers and colonizes the Americas, we're going to see these kinds of Catholic processions throughout Mexico and South America. This is from this incredible series of very large paintings from Cusco in Peru. And you can see here these sort of a group of friars processing, one again carrying a crucifix on a pole in front of these large ephemeral or temporary altars that are covered in paintings and mirrors and feathers, and everything is presided over by a portrait of the young king, Charles II. So, of course, this also reminds us that it's impossible to separate church and state in this period. Everything is part of the most Catholic monarchy. And finally, I'll show you this last painting. Just I thought it was wonderful because it so clearly indicates which image here is granted honor. And of course, it's because they're carrying over her this wonderful sort of canopy. So not only is she being moved on this wonderfully bedecked donkey or maybe a horse, but then also she's being protected by this canopy. So this, and of course we see a sort of wide range of individuals from friars to, of course, these very fancy gentlemen who are here accompanying the procession as well. So we saw just a brief element. This is from Antigua, Guatemala, just a few years ago. But this is also another crucial element in processions. Movement additionally activates the images. They themselves will move in response to the movement of the people who are carrying them. They will respond differently to conditions of light, of shadow, and so on and so forth. And especially something like a silver crucifix. It will reflect light in each moment, looking and behaving differently than it did in the previous. If you can imagine a sort of the bright light of a Castilian afternoon, the sort of blue sky and the light pouring down, of course the crucifix is going to respond and shine and shimmer as it's moved through that space. It's going to seem in many ways like a almost quasi-magical object. And here is our crucifix. Now, the processions in which such a crucifix may have been carried, I think, is most likely it was during Holy Week. Because this is an image that depicts the death of Christ on the cross. On the other side, of course, it's bookended by the birth of Christ, or the Christ in infancy. It's likely that such an object would have been part of Holy Week processions, which occur during the time when the Passion of Christ is believed to have happened. These kinds of objects would have formed part of a larger universe of objects and images that formed part of processions. For instance, in central Spain, if you've been to Valladolid, and if not, I really encourage it, the Museo Nacional de Escultura, the National Sculpture Museum, houses the so-called pasos. Paso quite literally means step in Spanish, but it's also the name used to describe these monumental sculptural groups made out of wood that include life-size figures of Christ and in the various episodes and moments of the Passion. So, for instance, the scourging of Christ, the preparations for the crucifixion. You can see here the crucifix is on the ground. Finally, the raising of the cross. This is one called the Paso Sed Tengo, I am thirsty, where he's being given a sponge soaked with vinegar. And of course, the Paso of Our Lady and St. John, or the Lamentation at the cross. So all of these would have moved through space alongside our crucifix. This was in some ways impossible to separate one from the others. When we see it enshrined in a glass case upstairs, in some ways it's necessary to try to think out from it into the ways in which it would have actually functioned in space as one of many elements of this sort of overwhelmingly multi-sensory, for many people very emotional experience. And I'll show you another short video clip from the Holy Week in Valladolid in 2015, where we'll see both the cross as well as these kinds of pasos moving through space to the accompaniment of very moving music. So it gives you a sense, I think, of the functioning. And whenever I'm teaching an undergrad lecture, I always try to remind the students that in some ways the objects we have upstairs, as fantastic as they are, have been stilled in a way. They no longer function in the ways for which they were designed, or in the manners for which they initially were created. And it's interesting and instructive, I think, to be sort of reminded of these types of things. I For instance, if you've been to the DMA, to the African galleries, I find it so interesting that there you're likely to see, for instance, a video of how objects are used, right, in some sort of ritual performances. But I've never yet seen a video being included in a European gallery, when in fact many of the objects were also used in similarly ritualized ways. And I think that could be a really interesting way to think about how these objects functioned and how that function is different now once they've entered into a museum collection. Now, the last part of today's lecture, I'm sort of afraid is the most boring. And so I hope you forgive me. But I couldn't resist because I find it interesting, and so sometimes I get excited about things, and well, I hope you bear with me. And if I get too boring, then you can just say, Adam, enough. Hopefully we won't get there, but if we do, I won't be offended. So I'd like to speak about the uses of crosses, the uses and abuses of crosses in early modern Spain. And to do so, I'd like to start with looking at this painting, a monumental canvas held at the Prado by the painter Francisco Ricci, depicting the auto da fe in the Plaza Mayor in Madrid, the inquisitorial trial that occurred there in 1680, in the 1680s. Now, you can see this is it almost becomes a sort of theatrical stage set to which we are privy to witness from above. We can see here the sort of bleachers that have been set up for the audience. Also, the audience is filling all of the balconies along the Plaza Mayor, and the king and his wife and mother sit here under a special baldachin presiding over this entire sort of chaos of people. It's an image that's filled with crucifixes. This is just a few that I've highlighted for you, and I'll show you details. But if we were to look, we could probably count 40 or 50 of them throughout the whole painting. And in some ways, this isn't surprising. For instance, if we look at these three details, and I hope you forgive me the graininess, the figures here with these high hats and red sort of tunics are the so-called reos, the people who have been accused and are under trial. Oftentimes, these are accusations of heresy, of blasphemy. Spain, which throughout the Middle Ages had been what we might call a multi-confessional society, right? Composed in large parts of Jewish and Muslim individuals alongside Christian individuals, in the late 15th century embarks on a campaign to become a single faith society. The Catholic monarchs declare that Spain will be the most Catholic kingdom. In 1492, the Jews are expelled from Spain. In the early 17th century, the descendants of the so-called Moriscos, people of Muslim heritage, are expelled. But of course, alongside that, there's a great concern that people might still be practicing either Islam or Judaism in secret. And this is also one of the main things that people might be processed for by the Inquisition. So for Judaizing practices, for instance, is one of the common criticisms that, not criticisms, common charges that are levied against individuals in Inquisition proceedings. Now, we don't know what any of these specific individuals did. Of course, this is an artist's imagining of this scene. But what is important is, of course, each of these individuals is being presented with a cross before their face, right? In each case, the friars, in this case Dominican friars, are holding a cross or indicating that the person should look upon the cross. You'll also notice that they have crosses on their garments, on their habits here. And actually, this individual here, too, also has on his cloak a cross indicating his membership in one of the aristocratic military orders. In this case, this might be Calatrava, but I'm actually not sure which one that is. It's not Santiago, which would be red. Perhaps one of you knows. Not sure myself. For instance, here, we'll notice that Here, this individual, in addition to this small crucifix that's being brought to their face, is also being encouraged to look at this larger cross that presides on top of the altar over the entire proceedings. Now, this tells us something about what crosses were believed to be able to do. Crosses and crucifixes are believed to have a real impact. They're believed that they can act upon those who see them. We'll often see this in scenes of conversion, for instance. These are illustrations from the lives of virtuous individuals, and time and again they're going to be depicted with the exact same gesture. By raising the cross, they're able to convert people to Catholicism, right? This is the sort of message that the artists wish for us to get from these images. And in this case, this is a woman who bilocated, according to her chroniclers. That is to say, she was able to be in two places at one time, both in Spain and in probably around Texas, actually. Where she would travel spiritually in order to convert local populations to Catholicism. And this is Francisco Solano, who you can see is in the sort of converting and, in this case, baptizing with a shell from which water is pouring forth these populations, which are meant to be understood as Asian or Middle Eastern. Right? So the gesture of the crucifix is having an impact on those who see it. The crucifix is also something that that one can sort of have a personal experience with. In this case, this incredible hyper-naturalistic sculpture by Martínez Montañez and Francisco Pacheco. Pacheco did the painting of it, of a penitent Saint Dominic, where the saint looks at the crucifix as a way of, in some ways, experiencing his own worthlessness, right? He is in an act of penance, and as he looks at the crucifix, he pummels his chest with a stone, and the artists have shown that he's just started to draw blood here in this sort of penitential practice. So a crucifix not only has the power to affect someone's conversion, but it's also a way for someone to focus their own prayers in a meditative way, and at times as a way of penance, as a penitential practice. Crosses and crucifixes can also be protective. I mentioned this when we talked about the processing of crucifixes around cities, but in this wonderful little portrait, we see that a royal princess has been literally covered in protective amulets. It's interesting because many of these were, of course, believed to be entirely heretical or pagan. And yet, the royal family appears to have thought that it was worth the risk. So not only are there pieces of red coral, of black jet, various bells and whistles, but also crosses, the cross being the most important central object that has been hung on this young princess's chest, with a secondary cross, just to make sure. So these are objects that can function as wards. These are objects that can deter any sort of malicious gaze, or what's called the evil eye, which was believed to be a real concern, particularly for children in the period. So our object functions in many ways, potentially, right? It's possible that people would understand it as having multiple functions or multiple significances when they saw it being taken out. They could understand it as being something that had the power to protect them. They could look at it and see themselves as worthless, as never being able to achieve the sort of sacrifice that Christ had performed. They could look at it and believe that that object had the power to convert those who were not Catholic around them, for instance. These objects were also, I think, because of this belief in their power and this concern about the supposed continued practice of Islam and Judaism, were also believed to be very vulnerable. A famous infamous, I should say, case that occurred in the mid-17th century in Madrid is that of the Cristo de la Paciencia, Christ of Patience, where there was a massive inquisitorial trial and execution of a number of individuals who were accused of defaming and attacking and destroying a crucifix. Destroying it, of course, the assumption was because they believed it to be a powerful object and they wanted to undo its power. Now, scholars largely believe that this had actually never happened, that this was actually probably a sort of, it happened on a sort of surge of anti-Semitic beliefs that happened to sort of bubble up in that moment, and that replicated a longer tradition of beliefs of Jews attacking or destroying crucifixes. In some ways, the images then sort of provided evidence where there was very little evidence to begin with. This is one example of the crucifix sort of being roasted on the fire, and this other one, much more explicit, of the family whipping and stabbing the crucifix, which, as you'll see, is bleeding here. So this image became, following the trial and following the sort of infamy that it was surrounded with, became a very powerful relic in its own right. People believed that the image had defended itself from these kinds of attacks and therefore centered their veneration on it. This was actually quite common to take these kinds of objects that had been subjected to some sort of attack. For instance, in Toledo, you can see a 15th century German crucifix that, according to legend, was repaired in the 17th century with gold. So the arms are attached from gold, the arms that were supposedly hacked off in a 16th century iconoclastic attack in Germany. And rather than obscuring the damage, the artist here chose to highlight it, showing that the crucifix still continued to be a powerful object, right? So I find that quite interesting. And it was precisely those kinds of behaviors that could lead to someone ending up here. The attacking of a crucifix, the disrespecting of a crucifix was a very common way that someone could be accused by the Inquisition of heretical behaviors. And the last example that I'll conclude with in a moment, we'll see the extreme to which that could be taken in the period. Now, it was precisely the fear and the tension that sort of racked Europe in the mid-16th century, produced by the iconoclastic movements of various Protestant groups in Northern Europe, that caused Catholics to want to define the role of images much more clearly. Protestants claimed that images were one of the ways in which the church mediated excessively between the faithful and the divine. And they claimed that images, therefore, for instance, especially Calvinists who destroyed religious Catholic imagery, claimed that this was a unnecessary and, in fact, idolatrous or heretical behavior, that images were bad. Catholics, on the other hand, claimed just the opposite. And so in this last section, I will just briefly walk through some of the beliefs that were that began to be standardized in the 16th century about the role of images and their importance. The Council of Trent was the Catholic ecclesiastical convention that gathered in the mid-16th century in order to begin to respond to these challenges that the Protestants had been levying against Catholic practices. And in the very last session of the Council of Trent in 1563, they finally got to the question of images. They were quite explicit. They said, the Holy Synod decrees that images of Christ, of the Virgin, of God, and of other saints are to be retained in temples, and that due honor and veneration are to be given to them. So in contrast to Protestant movements that advocated for the removal of images, the Catholics were here stating their continued adherence and support of images. However, no divinity or virtue is believed to be in them. as was of old done by the Gentiles who placed their hope in idols. Because the honor which is shown refers to the prototypes which those images represent. And finally, through the images which we kiss and before which we uncover the head, we adore Christ and we venerate the saints whose similitude they bear. Now, to me, the most important passage is this one. The honor which is shown to the image refers to the prototypes which those images represent. What this means is that although Catholics are saying that images are crucial to retain in religious practice, the images themselves are not sacred. Images serve as vehicles that can move a person's prayer, that can concentrate a person's worship, and they can move it to the holy figure in heaven that is represented by that image. And this is a crucial distinction. It's not that they are worshiping a golden calf, right? And this is the sort of mention of the Gentiles here. They are approaching the images in a much sort of more cool way. They are using them as a way to focus their prayers on the saint or on God who is in heaven. There were, however, three ways to worship. And I'll very quickly move you through these because they may seem very specific, but I promise that I'm getting to a quite explicit point here, if you bear with me. The first was latria, adoration. And you could only adore God with this degree of worship. This was the highest degree of worship. Next was hyperdulia. You could only worship the Virgin with hyperdulia. And finally was dulia, the lowest form, which was directed towards the saints. Now, you might say, what's the difference? How do I know if I'm performing dulia or hyperdulia or latria? And this was something that was absolutely a very sort of high-level discussion at the period. Most people in the 16th and 17th century had no idea how they were worshiping. But of course, to theologians and people who really thought about these issues, this was a crucial distinction because, of course, God was the most important. Everything else was in his image. One theologian, Paleotti, an important Italian figure, wrote that we appear to kneel indifferently before the Holy Sacrament, that is to say God, the image of the glorious Virgin and of the saints. Right? He says, in the way in which we behave, there's no difference. However, even though we doff our cap before king and gentleman alike, we are saluting the king with a different intention than the gentleman. And it's, of course, this idea of intention, that you approach your worship in a conscious way, that every form, every moment you engage in worship, you are doing so in a conscious way. Of course, this is perhaps some wishful thinking on Paleotti's part. It's unlikely that most people would have understood these issues with such precision. And finally, my conclusion. Paleotti, when writing about latria, describes who it is owed to. He says latria, as we know, is owed exclusively to God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost and their mysteries. And then he goes on to say that God is the author, creator, and governor of the universe. Now, Francisco Pacheco, many of you may know this figure. He was a painter, a theorist. He was perhaps, maybe a little unfairly, best known for being the father-in-law to Diego Velázquez, the important 17th century painter. He translated Paleotti into Spanish for the first time. He claimed to do so completely verbatim. He said that he didn't introduce any changes. And until recently, this was taken at face value. When Pacheco writes, latria is due only to God, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, that seems okay. But then he adds something. And then he says, and to their divine images and the most blessed sacrament on the altar. He then says the same thing, that God is the great author and maker and governor of the universe. And then he adds another paragraph. And we owe the same reverence and worship of latria to every cross, made of whatever material, because they are portrayals not only of the one on which the Lord was placed, but of his own divine person. Now, Felipe Pereda, a scholar who actually recently spoke at the Meadows Museum about 2 years ago, is the one who noticed for the first time that although Pacheco claimed to be a passive translator of Paleotti, was actually introducing a very particularly Spanish belief in the theory of images. He was here claiming that not only was God the only recipient of latria, of this highest form of worship, but actually every image that depicted God too. Now, this might seem to be at odds with what we just read about the Council of Trent, that images are simply things that redirect, that remove our prayer from us and direct it to a holy entity. Here, Pacheco is saying that images in some ways have something of the divine in them. And it's no mistake that he mentions the Blessed Sacrament too. If you're familiar with Catholicism, you'll know that in the moment of transubstantiation during Mass, the host, the piece of the wafer, actually becomes God during Mass. And Pacheco is introducing here a particularly Spanish belief that actually certain kinds of images were not just pieces of wood wrapped in metal, that they were actually holy. This is something that is absolutely particular to Spanish Catholicism in the period and represents a completely sort of unique and, from the point of view of Roman Catholicism, perhaps actually quite heretical approach to what images are, particularly the crucifix, which we can now return to. So it almost becomes therefore unsurprising that images such as this one, the Christ of Burgos, which is made out of leather, giving it a very fleshy quality and painted with this incredibly naturalistic depiction of wounds, should be done in this way. If images of God are God, then of course it makes sense that they be depicted in a way or created in a way that elides any sort of sense of their having been made by a human artist. They become almost the real thing. So we see here the different ways that these kinds of images can function. They can have a power of converting. They can catalyze internal penitential practice. And also, they are more than just images. At least, this is how it was believed in Spain. They are actually believed to be or to have something of the divine within them. It's therefore no surprise that the outrage that developed around this episode was so extreme, because this was not just the attacking of an object or a crucifix. This was actually an attack on God, or so it was believed, of course. Now, I promised I'd conclude with one episode to show you the extremes to which this could lead. In 1630 in Madrid, the inquisitors were told that a man had been walking with a group of friends and had stepped on the shadow cast by a crucifix. And they told him, "What are you doing? You can't step on the shadow of the crucifix, you have to go around it." And he, rather than heeding them, stepped again and said, "I didn't do anything wrong, I'm not stepping on a crucifix." Sure enough, the inquisitors were not happy about this, and he got involved in a full-blown trial for heresy, for disrespecting a crucifix. Now, what they said, this is very legalese, I should warn you. If he did not aim to disrespect the cross, because he believed that the shadow of the cross was not a cross in the same way that the shadow of a man is not a man, and that was the reason why he did not stop himself from stepping on it, then he would only be, I'll paraphrase this, then he would only be punished for this if he were ill-intentioned. What they're saying, and this is, I think, the most important part, he believed that the shadow of the cross was not a cross because a shadow of a man is not a man. And they said yes and no. If his intention was to disrespect the cross, then he should be punished. But if he did not understand, then he shouldn't. So even stepping on a shadow of the cross, and I think this only could have happened in Spain, which had this very particular idea of the cross specifically, particular out of all religious images, as being something more than just an image, as actually being a representation of the divine. On that note, thank you very much for bearing with me.